I really do feel like Mr. Rogers. I'm Kathleen. I am the head yarn wench at Republica Unicornia, and this is a tour of my brand new home dye studio. So I'm switching into the very sexy studio crocks. Don't mock, they're the best. Yarn dyeing involves a lot of water, and so I splash, and so the crocks are actually fantastic, and they're supportive. So we're gonna start with the dye itself. This is where I store all of my dye. I have it organized by color so I can find everything, and it's all labeled. When I measure dye, I mix it up by volume, just like in baking, and I'm pretty exacting, and so I actually have two scales. I have a tiny one, here's the tiny one for dye, which uses a small amount, and then the bigger one is for measuring water amounts. And we have a deluxe upgraded sink. If you saw my earlier studio tour, you will know that it was only one-sided sink, and I upgraded to a two-sided sink one with the most ridiculous fancy faucet. I feel it's just amazing. I love this thing. So yarn dyeing uses quite a bit of water, so you use water to mix up dye, you wash out yarn, you wash giant pans, like there's just a lot. So I really did need a huge utility sink, and this one is enormous and I love it very much. And then over here, I'm gonna move my camping chair. I move this around so when I need a little downtime, I can take a seat. This is where I store a lot of my equipment. So what you see here, this is tools like spatulas and stuff like that, but yarn dyeing involves powder dye, and so in order to protect my lungs from getting rainbow lung, I use a respirator. It was very hard during max pandemic time to get the filters, and they are back in my life, and I'm pleased. Lots and lots of towels. Again, lots of water gets thrown around, and so I go through tons of towels. Also, all of the mason jars that I use to mix dye, glass washes out a lot easier than plastic, so I've sort of made the switch over. And on that note, I just ordered these, which I love very much. They are gallon glass jars for mixing dye, and they just rinse out and stuff doesn't stain. They're amazing. They're a little heavy, but that's my workout. Just wanted to talk about this really quickly. This is citric acid, just like plain food grade citric acid. Protein fibers require acid and heat to set, and so a lot of people use vinegar. I don't, because you have to use quite a bit of it to get the pH low enough to actually dye the yarn. And also, it smells like hot pickled wet sheep instead of just hot wet sheep. So I really like the citric acid. So I buy it in like giant bags, and that's what I use. Okay, we have just like a gratuitous yarn shot. Yarn, I actually do dye yarn in my studio. Here's a little bit. Tons will be available soon. So there's some yarn. This is pretty indispensable. This is my stainless steel prep table. It's a piece of restaurant supply equipment, and it is a very comfortable height for mixing dye, and I actually use dye yarn on it, and everything wipes clean. I lived in an apartment and dyed in an apartment for a long time that had white laminate countertops, and after that, the joy of stainless steel cannot be overestimated. My husband is agreeing since he did a lot of the scrubbing. Underneath, these are also restaurant supply pans. These are hotel pans, and these are what I actually use to dye yarn in. And I have 24 pans, and I have 24 lids, and so a maximum dye day I can do 98 skeins of yarn, which is about all physically I'm up for, because by the time you move 24 pans around and they're hot and heavy, it's just kind of a lot. Also, I want to show what I'm standing on. Let's show over here. This is actually from our old kitchen, but I also have just plain black mats. These are squishy foam mats because standing on concrete is horrible for your back. I try to take really good care of my body because it gets a lot of use. Okay, so that's the table, squishy mats. This is like the main attraction. This is also a piece of restaurant supply equipment. It is a proofing and warming cabinet. Its on-label use is for proofing bread doughs. And someone, I have no idea who, but thank you, figured out that it works really well for yarn dye. So as I said, protein fibers, so like silk, wool, everything I dye, requires both heat and acid to set. And for a long time, I did low water immersion dyeing on the stovetop in my house. And when I moved into a studio that I rented, I needed not open flame. And so I went with this, and it is a low and slow process. Think of it as the difference between cooking on the stovetop and cooking in a crock pot. And this is definitely like the crock pot version. It does get hot enough. It takes me, I think the yarn steams for probably by the time all is said and done, for 4 hours or so, just because of prep time. And so what I do is I put my pans here, and I put a little bit of water and some citric acid in a pan, and I do whatever magic I do depending on the colorway, put the lid on, stick it in here, and it gets up to about 200 degrees. Supposed to, I would say it mainly stays at about like 190, which is warm enough to set the dye. And then, so if I'm doing a colorway that has a lot of speckles and has colors on the back, I will let it set for a while and then take it out and speckle the back. Or if I'm doing a colorway that has multiple colors of dye, so a lot of my tonal, the more semi-solid colors, are multiple colors of dye, and so I'll do like step one and then over dye it with another color, which is how I get depth of color. I love this thing. It is fantastic. I sprung for the insulated one, which is great because it's hot in Georgia most of the time, and it is more efficient to have the insulated one. It's an investment. I would not have done it if I was just playing with yarn on my own, but for the business, it's just so efficient. And it does speckles really well. So I'm a big fan of that. So that's my baby. We call it the yarn disc because it's like the TARDIS because it holds so much more than you think. And we're gonna go over here and just drying racks. So when I'm done dyeing yarn, it gets hung up. Before that happens, I use a spin dryer. Mine is old and on its last little legs. I keep pushing it. You have to like smack it to get it to work. It is like an electric salad spinner. And so when I'm done dyeing yarn and it's cooled down and set, I soak it and wash it out. And then it goes in here and it spins out all the extra water, and then I hang it up on the drying racks, and it dries a lot faster that way. We also have our lovely hot water heater. It's our garage, like this is part of my house. And I have 5-gallon buckets, which I use for all kinds of things like soaking and washing yarn. They get a lot of use and really like them. And then just a little bit of admin storagey stuff over here, my whiteboard where I just put up ideas and notes that I need, my dye recipes, just pens and stuff, you know, like it's kind of like my office. So this is where all of the dyeing happens. I have another space, we don't even know what to call it. We've been calling it the inside studio, which is where all of the sewing happens, where all the yarn is stored. You'll notice there's not really actually yarn in here because again, it's my garage. And so I want to keep the yarn nice and safe. And so it stays inside. And so all the yarn's inside, and my sewing machine and my fabric and all of that. So there's actually 2 spaces that I use, but this is where the dyeing happens. I think that's it.